The rain had been falling since before dawn, the kind that didn't rush or roar but settled in like it planned to stay all day. It slicked the streets of New Haven until the asphalt shone like dark glass and soaked through Clara Benson's shoes before she realized it had. She stood across from the Wellington estate with her hands buried in her coat pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, watching black vehicles glide through the iron gates. They arrived one after another, quiet and deliberate. Long sedans. Black SUVs. A hearse that slowed as it turned, tires hissing against wet stone, as if even it understood this wasn't just another stop. So it's real, she thought. Jonathan Wellington was dead. That was the headline. That was what the radio said on her way into town. That was what her sister had whispered on the phone the night before, her voice careful, like she was afraid the words might crack something open. Billionaire. Private. Found unresponsive. No signs of struggle. Clara shifted her weight, the cold creeping up through her feet. She hadn't planned to come. She told herself that again and again while pacing her apartment, while folding laundry she didn't need folded, while staring at the ceiling long after midnight. It wasn't her place. She wasn't family. She wasn't current staff. She was just someone who used to clean rooms in that mansion and had learned, quietly, how thin the wall between power and humanity could be. A sharp wind rattled the bare branches lining the drive. Clara hugged herself tighter and glanced down at the envelope in her hand. The paper was worn soft from being folded too many times. One corner was smudged where rain had touched it earlier. She hadn't written a name on the front. She never needed to. You going in, or are you just admiring the weather? The voice came from behind her. Clara turned to see an older man holding an umbrella at a losing battle against the wind. His tie was slightly crooked. His expression was tired but not unkind. I'm deciding, she said. He gave a small nod, like that answer fit perfectly into his understanding of the world. Funerals have a way of making people do that. Then he crossed the street, blending into the slow procession toward the gates. The guards barely looked at him. Clara watched him disappear inside and exhaled. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from her sister. You don't owe anyone anything. Please remember that. Clara slipped the phone away without replying. 5 years ago, she had stood in a hospital hallway that smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee, listening to doctors explain things she barely understood. Jonathan Wellington had stood beside her, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused, asking calm questions while her hands shook. He hadn't promised miracles. He'd just said, "Let me see what I can do." And then he did it. That memory pressed against her now, heavier than grief. He hadn't been loud or sentimental. Just present. That mattered. She stepped off the curb. The guards noticed her immediately. One of them straightened, eyes flicking from her coat to her shoes, then to her face. Clara felt that familiar sensation of being measured, categorized. I'm here for the service, she said before either could speak. Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. Invitation? One asked. No. Pause. The bell inside the estate chimed softly. Somewhere a door closed. Time kept moving. I worked here, Clara added. A few years back. The second guard leaned in, murmured something she couldn't hear. The first studied her a moment longer, then stepped aside just enough. Stay toward the back, he said. Clara nodded and walked through the gates. Inside, the estate felt altered. Quieter. Heavier. The air smelled like lilies and polished wood, layered with something sharper beneath it. Nerves, maybe. Conversations dipped as she passed. Not enough to stop, but enough for her to feel their weight. She followed the long hallway, past the staircase she'd climbed countless times with cleaning carts and folded sheets. Her footsteps sounded louder than she remembered. The room where the service was being held came into view. The casket was already there. Dark. Glossy. Close. Her chest tightened. This was it. The moment denial was supposed to end. She stopped just inside the doorway, listening to low murmurs, watching familiar and unfamiliar faces take their seats. And then it hit her. Not grief. Not yet. Unease. She couldn't explain it. Just a quiet wrongness that settled in her stomach and refused to move. Her fingers curled around the envelope in her pocket. If you've ever trusted a feeling you couldn't explain, you might want to stay with this story. And if you find yourself drawn in already, this is one of those moments where subscribing, sticking around, might be worth it. You never know what you'll witness next. And if you're watching from somewhere far away, maybe even comment where you're listening from. Clara took a slow breath and stepped further into the room. She didn't know it yet, but nothing about this funeral was going to end the way anyone expected. The room smelled of lilies and polished wood, a heavy fragrance that pressed against Clara's chest as she walked toward the back, careful to keep her head low. The guests in black were seated in neat rows, whispers threading between them like the faint hiss of the rain against the windows. Some stole glances at her as she passed, curiosity flickering in their eyes. She felt it, the weight of attention, of judgment, but she forced herself to breathe slowly and focus on one thing: the casket. Jonathan Wellington's casket. Dark, glossy, final. Or so everyone thought. Clara had never been a loud person. Even at her busiest, when the mansion demanded every ounce of her energy, she moved quietly, blending in, observing. It had saved her more than once. But today she didn't want to blend in. Not now. Something was off and she had to see it for herself. The service had already begun. The first speaker, a man who claimed to be an old friend of Jonathan's, spoke about generosity, innovation, and legacy. Clara listened, nodding faintly, though her mind was elsewhere. She remembered the night Jonathan had stayed by her brother's bedside, making impossible calls, fighting hospital bureaucracy, staying calm while she had fallen apart in panic. None of these stories were being told here. None of the whispers in this grand room reflected the real man she had known. She shifted, letting her eyes scan the room. Faces blurred together. Business associates, distant relatives, journalists. No one knew the depth of what had happened between her and him. No one would unless she said something. And yet, even stepping in felt dangerous. From her corner, she could see Mrs. Palmer. The house manager's expression was a mix of surprise and irritation. Clara guessed she hadn't expected to see her here. The older woman gave her a sharp glance but didn't approach. Clara wondered if she would be stopped, asked to leave, or, worse, ignored. As she settled into a seat near the back, Clara's mind wandered to that hospital night. Her brother, barely 10, weak and gasping for breath. The cold fear of losing him, of never getting another chance. And then Jonathan, steady, focused, listening to the doctors, making impossible things happen. She had learned something important that night. The world's richest man could be the kindest person if no one else would step up. The eulogies continued. Words flowed in smooth, rehearsed sentences about philanthropy and innovation, leaving out the messy human truths she remembered. Clara felt a pang in her chest. This wasn't grief anymore. It was frustration. The real story was being hidden, just like it had always been when she'd worked inside these walls. Then a sound made her flinch. A soft creak from the floor near the casket. So subtle that no one else seemed to notice. She tilted her head, listening. The sound came again, a faint shift, almost like movement. Clara's heart thumped, a little faster than it should have. Maybe it was her imagination. Maybe it wasn't. She inched closer, careful to blend into the shadows. Every step felt amplified, like the world had narrowed into the space between her and that casket. Her hand tightened around the envelope in her pocket. Something told her she wasn't just here to mourn. A voice rose from the front. Jonathan Wellington touched the lives of so many, the speaker said, voice strong, practiced, calm. Though we mourn him today, we must also remember his vision, his drive, and his extraordinary impact on the world. Clara's stomach churned. Vision and drive. Yes. But humanity? Compassion? Courage? Those had been the real Jonathan Wellington. And he was still out there somewhere, or at least she hoped he was. Her gaze flicked to the pallbearers. They stood rigid, hands clenched at the sides of the casket. And then, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, the casket lid shifted. Just a fraction, but enough. Clara froze. Her breath caught. The room seemed to hold its collective pulse, though no one else had noticed. Her mind raced. Could it be possible? No. He was dead. Or at least everyone believed he was. And yet, instinct screamed that something was wrong. She glanced at Mrs. Palmer, who was distracted by a conversation nearby. No help there. Not yet. Clara realized that if she was going to see the truth, it was on her alone. The words of the speaker washed over her, hollow and rehearsed, as she leaned just slightly closer to the casket. She couldn't stop herself. Her fingers itched to touch it, to lift it, to know. And then she remembered something Jonathan had once told her in the mansion years ago. Quiet words, spoken after a long night of panic and fear. "Sometimes the truth waits for the right person to notice it," he had said. Clara's chest tightened. Maybe this was her moment. Maybe it was time to see what others were too polite, or too afraid, to acknowledge. She took a slow breath, glanced around once more, and inched toward the casket, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room seemed to blur at the edges. Each footstep was a countdown. She didn't know what she would find. And the closer she got, the more certain she became. Nothing about this funeral was ordinary. Her fingers hovered just above the casket handle. And then, a muffled gasp from someone behind her made her turn slightly. All eyes weren't on her yet, but tension was mounting. Clara's pulse quickened. The truth was right in front of her. And the world inside that room was about to shatter. She swallowed hard, her hand trembling slightly, and prepared for what she might find beneath that glossy lid. The hall was quieter now, if only slightly. The whispers had grown into a low murmur, punctuated by the soft rustle of clothing and the occasional cough. Clara's eyes never left the casket. The slight shift she had noticed earlier lingered in her mind like a warning she couldn't ignore. Every instinct she had learned over years of navigating this house, reading people, reading moments, told her something wasn't right. She remembered that night in the hospital vividly. Her brother, barely 10, lying pale and trembling, hooked to machines that beeped and hissed. Doctors had shrugged, busy with their rounds, leaving her standing there helpless. And then Jonathan had appeared. Not as the media celebrated billionaire, but as a man who could make decisions others wouldn't dare. His calm presence had cut through the panic. He hadn't offered empty promises. He had acted. Clara had never told anyone the truth of that night, not her sister, not her friends. Jonathan's reputation in the public eye was pristine, untouchable, composed, untarnished. But the real Jonathan Wellington, the man who had stood by her in the most desperate hours, was more than the headlines suggested. And now, standing in that grand hall, she felt that same man's presence, or at least the echo of it. She crouched slightly, the hem of her coat brushing the polished floor, and studied the pallbearers. Their hands were tense, their postures rigid. One of them shifted as if sensing her attention. Clara's heart beat faster. A faint creak, just a whisper, sounded from the casket again. She froze. Surely it couldn't be. Not here. Not now. Every rational thought screamed that she was imagining it, but the sensation in her chest told her otherwise. Something was alive beneath that lid. She pressed her lips together, trying to steady herself. Clara had learned over the years that fear could be as sharp as knives and just as dangerous. Acting on instinct, she inched closer, careful to avoid drawing too much attention. Guests continued their quiet observances, mostly oblivious, but she noticed a few glances in her direction. Some curious, some judgmental. She ignored them. Nothing else mattered. Her mind flickered back to the mansion 5 years ago. She had been so small then, so invisible, yet Jonathan had seen her. He had seen the panic, the desperation, the helplessness. He hadn't dismissed her. He had listened. He had acted. That memory anchored her now, gave her courage she didn't know she still had. As she drew nearer, her fingers brushed the edge of the casket handle. The metal was cool, smooth, almost unnaturally so in contrast to the warm, expectant air of the room. She exhaled slowly, trying to regulate the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. One hand gripped the envelope in her coat pocket, the other hovered above the lid. The speaker at the front was now talking about Jonathan's achievements, the companies he had built, the awards he had received. Words like visionary and trailblazer floated across the room. But Clara's focus was elsewhere. Achievements and accolades didn't matter right now. Life and truth did. Her mind ran through the what-ifs. What if he wasn't really dead? What if this wasn't just a funeral, but a lie stitched together to protect him or someone else? The thought was reckless, almost absurd, but it had lodged itself in her mind like a seed. Clara's fingers touched the handle fully now. A shiver ran through her. The casket was heavier than she expected, as if resisting her curiosity. She glanced around. No one was paying enough attention to stop her. This might be the only chance she had. She remembered Jonathan's words from that hospital hallway. Sometimes the truth waits for the right person to notice it. Her breath caught. That was now. She was the right person. She had to see. Clara bent slightly, gathering the courage she had cultivated over years of hardship, and started to lift the lid. Just a fraction, barely noticeable, but enough to feel resistance. Her pulse thundered in her ears. And then, a sudden gasp echoed from somewhere near the front. Heads turned. Eyes widened. The room seemed to pause, collectively holding its breath. Clara froze, her hand on the lid, heart hammering. The lid shifted slightly more beneath her fingers. Something, or someone, was alive under there. Clara's mind screamed at her to pull back, to let it go, to leave the drama to the mourners and the wealthy. But every fiber of her being told her she couldn't. Not this time. Not now. She gripped the envelope tighter, the paper crumpling slightly in her hand. This moment would change everything. She just didn't know how yet. Her pulse echoed in her ears. The faint sound of movement came again from the casket. Not her imagination. Something was alive beneath the lid. And she realized, with a mix of terror and exhilaration, that she was about to confront a truth no one else in that room was ready to face. Clara's hand trembled as she steadied herself. She had taken the first step. The next one would decide everything. Clara's fingers tightened around the casket handle, her knuckles whitening. Every nerve in her body was alive, buzzing with a mix of fear, adrenaline, and something she couldn't quite name, hope, maybe, or disbelief. The hum of whispered condolences faded into the background. The polished hall, the murmuring guests, even the soft scent of lilies became distant, replaced by a singular focus, the slight, almost imperceptible movement beneath her hands. She glanced around once. Mrs. Palmer stood a few feet away, her eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. The house manager's expression was a mixture of irritation and shock, as if she had spotted something she didn't know how to respond to. Clara considered retreating. Perhaps she shouldn't be here. Perhaps this was crossing a line. And then she remembered that night in the hospital, Jonathan's steady voice cutting through the chaos, saying nothing would stop him from doing what had to be done. He had acted when no one else would. Clara realized she could do the same. She pressed her hand down a little harder on the lid. It moved slightly, the resistance softening. Her heart raced. She could hear her own breath, shallow and fast. She swallowed and took a step closer, bending low to stabilize herself. The polished wood felt cold beneath her fingertips, a shocking contrast to the heat of her own panic. From somewhere near the front, a guest coughed softly. Clara flinched, realizing that even a single sound could betray her. She straightened slightly, trying to look like she belonged, like she was just another mourner lost in the solemnity of the moment. No one seemed to be paying her more than passing attention. She had a chance and she wasn't going to let it slip. Her thoughts raced back to her brother again. How sick he had been. How helpless she felt. How Jonathan had stepped in without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. He had been her anchor when everything around her was collapsing. Could she not be his now in some small way? Could she let this moment pass without acting? The soft creak came again, louder this time. Clara froze. She could no longer convince herself it was imagination. Movement. Someone, or something, was alive beneath that lid. Her pulse pounded in her ears, echoing louder than the whispers and murmurs around her. A bead of sweat traced down her temple despite the chill in the room. She bent lower, fingers trembling slightly, and began to lift the casket lid just a little more. Enough to see. Enough to confirm. Then Mrs. Palmer's voice cut through, sharp and disbelieving. "Clara Benson. What on earth are you doing?" Clara froze mid-motion, the lid halfway lifted. She swallowed hard. I need to see," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I need to see Jonathan Wellington." The hall went silent. Eyes snapped toward her. Gasps filled the air, whispers cut short, and someone muttered under their breath. A few of the pallbearers tensed, glancing nervously at each other. Clara's heart sank and soared at the same time. All at once, she felt the weight of every judgmental glance, every raised eyebrow, and the possibility that she might be entirely wrong, and yet she couldn't stop. The lid resisted slightly but gave way more with her next push. Clara's stomach knotted. She could feel the contours of the casket shifting beneath her hands. Movement, subtle but undeniable, pressed against the truth she had long feared and long hoped for. A distant murmur from the gathered guests swelled as someone noticed her. Some whispered, some laughed nervously, assuming she was overreacting. But Clara knew better. She had felt it. A faint, irregular breath, the smallest rise beneath the polished wood. Someone was alive. Her hand froze, trembling, her mind a storm of fear, disbelief, and anticipation. Could this really be happening? Had the world been wrong? Had everyone been wrong? And then a tiny rasping voice, so quiet it might have been mistaken for the wind, escaped the casket. Clara. The name was drawn out, weak, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. Clara's eyes widened. She felt her knees threaten to buckle. It was him. Jonathan Wellington. Alive. Her mind raced as she realized the gravity of what was happening. Everyone in this room believed him dead. Everyone, except her, was about to face a truth that would shatter their perception of reality. She drew a shaky breath, bracing herself. This was only the beginning. What came next could change everything, not just for Jonathan but for everyone in this room. Clara looked around, meeting Mrs. Palmer's stunned gaze, and whispered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else, "I had to be here." And just as the first real stirrings of chaos began to ripple through the room, a soft, almost imperceptible click sounded from the far side of the hall. Someone else had noticed. The room was about to explode. The room had gone still, as if the air itself had frozen. Clara's heart thundered in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears louder than the murmurs of the stunned guests. The faint rasp of Jonathan's voice had been unmistakable, yet almost no one else seemed to fully comprehend what had just happened. Faces turned, eyes wide, some mouths hanging open, some hands covering them in disbelief. Whispers erupted, threading through the hall like a sudden gust of wind, a mixture of shock, curiosity, and fear. Clara held her place near the casket, trembling slightly but refusing to step back. She could barely process the reality herself. He was alive. Jonathan Wellington, the man the world had mourned, was alive right there beneath the polished lid she had lifted. And though he was weak, pale, and breathing unevenly, there was no mistaking it. He was alive. Mrs. Palmer's lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes were sharp with disbelief. How is this possible?" she whispered, mostly to herself. Her hand hovered over her mouth as though speaking any louder might shatter the moment completely. Clara said nothing, only letting her eyes meet Jonathan's as he lifted his hand weakly. "Clara," his voice came again, rasping and fragile, yet infused with recognition. He tried to push himself up, and Clara instinctively leaned closer, steadying the lid, supporting his motion. A few steps back, guests murmured nervously. Some fumbled for phones, others whispered questions they didn't dare voice aloud. Is this a miracle? Or something darker? Clara's mind raced. She needed to get him out of the casket without causing panic, or worse, harm. Her fingers clutched his hand, which was cold and trembling. The warmth of her own hand seemed to ground her. "You're okay," she whispered, though it was half a promise, half reassurance to herself. "I've got you." Jonathan's eyes fluttered, then focused on her. They can't know yet," he rasped, voice barely above a whisper. "Not everyone." Clara nodded. She knew exactly what he meant. He had enemies, people who would see this as an opportunity to strike, to take advantage of the chaos. But here, in this room filled with guests who had assumed he was gone, she had to be careful. Calm. Strategic. Somewhere near the front, one of the pallbearers took a cautious step back, muttering under his breath. Others glanced at each other, confusion and alarm written clearly on their faces. The room's energy shifted from mourning to tense anticipation. Every second that passed felt elongated, like time itself was holding its breath. Clara's thoughts flickered again to the hospital night, the one memory she held onto more than any other. Her brother fighting for his life. She had been desperate, panicked, alone. Jonathan had stayed calm. Had acted decisively when everyone else faltered. He had been a rare kind of presence, steady, reassuring, effective. That man, the one she had trusted with her deepest fear, was alive. And now she had to do the same for him. A soft cough broke her focus. She looked up. Several guests had begun to edge closer, drawn by curiosity or the faint suspicion that something unusual was happening. She sensed their questions forming. Is he alive? Oh, what? She didn't have time to answer them. The only thing she could do was act. Stay back, she said quietly, firm but calm, trying to regain a semblance of control over the chaos. Her words barely carried across the hall, yet somehow, a few turned their attention toward her, pausing. Enough. It gave her the opening she needed. Jonathan's hand squeezed hers faintly. He was weak but alert. Clara, they can't know, he whispered again. It's not safe yet. Clara nodded, biting her lip. She had to think fast. She couldn't simply leave him here. The room was filled with too many people, too many unknowns. Every second increased the risk. And yet, she couldn't abandon him now, not after coming this far, not after knowing the truth. Her eyes scanned the hall, calculating. She spotted a side door near the back, partially hidden behind a velvet curtain. If she could reach it without drawing attention, she could get him to a private space, even briefly. She gestured subtly to Jonathan, and he nodded faintly, trusting her implicitly despite the weakness in his body. Clara took a deep breath and started toward the side door, supporting Jonathan carefully as she moved. Her steps were deliberate, measured, and as quiet as possible. A few guests whispered, some craned their necks, but she didn't stop. Every second mattered. And then, just as she reached the door, a sharp gasp echoed from the front. A guest had noticed the subtle movement. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Someone whispered urgently, almost panicked, "Wait, is that?" Clara froze for half a heartbeat. Every muscle in her body tensed. The world narrowed into the space between the casket, Jonathan, and the gathering crowd. She clenched her jaw and whispered to Jonathan, "Just a little further. Stay with me." The next steps would decide everything. The room was silent, waiting. And just like that, the line between life, death, and truth blurred entirely. The side door loomed ahead, partially hidden behind the velvet curtain. Clara's palms were slick with sweat despite the chill in the hall, but she refused to falter. Every nerve in her body screamed caution, yet each step forward was deliberate. She could feel Jonathan's trembling weight against her arm, weak but alive, fragile as glass yet fiercely real. "Almost there," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her voice was low, steady, designed not to alarm the growing number of curious onlookers. His eyes fluttered open, scanning the room. The first inkling of recognition, fear, confusion, hope, danced across them. Clara's mind raced. If anyone realized what was happening, chaos would erupt. Security might intervene, guests might panic, and worst of all, Jonathan's enemies, those who had orchestrated his supposed death, could act on the opportunity. She couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. She guided him toward the curtain, sliding it aside carefully. The muffled whispers of the crowd grew louder as a few guests noticed the unusual movement near the casket. Heads turned. Some gasped. Phones lifted. Clara ignored them all, focusing on the small room behind the curtain, a narrow side corridor that led to the study. It was barely used, dusty and private. "Here," she murmured, gently lowering Jonathan onto a chair. The leather creaked under his weight. He leaned back, pale and shivering. Clara grabbed a soft blanket from a nearby coat rack and draped it over his shoulders. His hand grazed hers, cold but alive, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe. "Clara, why?" he asked weakly, voice rasping. "How did you?" "I didn't believe they were right," she interrupted, biting back the rest of the words. I couldn't accept it." Her voice trembled slightly, and she glanced down at the envelope in her pocket. She had carried it across the rainy streets for this very moment, unsure of whether it contained a solution, a confession, or nothing at all. Jonathan's lips curved faintly into a weak smile. "You've always been fearless, he whispered. There was gratitude in his eyes but also worry. You shouldn't have come here. It's dangerous. Clara shook her head. I had to. You're alive and no one else knows it. Not yet. I won't let anyone ruin this, not again. She swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on her chest. She hadn't realized until now how much of herself she had tied to this moment. She had come for him, but she had also come to reclaim a piece of the past she had buried long ago. Outside, the hall erupted into murmurs and confusion. A few people had begun moving toward the side corridor, curiosity overpowering decorum. Clara's heart raced. Every second counted. She needed a plan fast. Jonathan coughed, weak but urgent. We don't have much time, he said, his voice stronger than before. Some of them they'll know soon. Clara nodded, her mind already mapping out the next steps. They had to get him somewhere safe. Somewhere he could recover, think and plan. But the immediate threat, the eyes in the hall, the gossip, the potential for panic, needed to be managed first. A sharp rap at the main door startled her. Someone was approaching the corridor. Clara's pulse accelerated. She barely had time to shift Jonathan slightly behind the desk when the door creaked open. A young man in a suit peeked in, his expression polite but curious. Excuse me, he began, voice low. Is everything all right in here? Clara met his gaze, steady. Yes. Just giving him a moment to rest, she said. Her words were calm, even soothing, but every muscle in her body was ready to spring into action if needed. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Right, of course, he said, retreating with a polite bow. The door clicked shut. Clara exhaled sharply, feeling a mix of relief and lingering tension. Jonathan leaned back further, exhaustion written across his face. I owe you everything, he whispered, almost to himself. You saved me, again. Clara shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. No. You saved yourself, Jonathan. You just let me be there to see it. She took a moment to observe him, pale, fragile, but undeniably alive. The casket, the funeral, the whispers, it all seemed distant now, a world apart. But she knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge wasn't getting him out of the hall unnoticed, it was what would come after. The envelope in her pocket pressed against her side, a reminder of the secret she carried. She hadn't opened it yet. Not here. Not now. The truth inside could wait a little longer. First, they had to survive the immediate chaos. A sudden shout from the main hall pierced the corridor. Guests had begun murmuring louder. Someone was moving closer, and Clara knew instinctively that the fragile window of privacy they had was closing fast. She tightened her grip on the blanket around Jonathan's shoulders and whispered, Hold on. We're not done yet. Not by a long shot. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Clara's stomach knotted. Every step brought the risk of discovery closer, but it also brought the next chapter of truth nearer, one that no one in that room would be prepared for. Jonathan's faint eyes met hers. I trust you, he said, voice barely audible. Clara nodded, steeling herself. And I'll prove that you can. The door handle rattled. The moment had arrived. The door handle rattled again, harder this time. Clara felt the vibration travel through the desk and into her bones. She pressed one finger to Jonathan's lips, signaling silence, while her other hand reached for the light switch beside the bookshelf. With a soft click, the room dimmed, shadows swallowing the corners. Who is it? Clara called out, keeping her voice calm, almost bored. It's Martin, came the reply. Security. We've had reports. Clara closed her eyes for half a second. Of course. Reports meant questions. Questions meant delays. And delays were dangerous. Just a moment, she said. He fainted. The stress. There was a pause. Clara could picture Martin outside the door, earpiece buzzing, eyes darting as instructions filtered in. Jonathan shifted slightly behind the desk, his breath shallow but steady. His hand found hers again, fingers tightening weakly, grounding them both. The door creaked open. Martin stepped in, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression professional but alert. His eyes swept the room, landing on Jonathan almost immediately. Clara watched the flicker of surprise he tried, and failed, to hide. "He doesn't look like a guest," Martin said carefully. "No," Clara replied. "He's family." Jonathan let out a soft groan, playing the part. Martin took a step closer, concern battling suspicion on his face. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Just needed air," he murmured. Martin studied him for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Clara could almost hear her own heartbeat. One wrong word, one wrong move, and everything would collapse. Finally, Martin straightened. "I'll radio for medical assistance," he said. "No," Clara said too quickly. Then she softened her tone. "Please. He doesn't want a scene. We'll take care of it privately." Martin hesitated. His hand hovered near his radio. "I can't ignore protocol." Clara met his gaze, unwavering. "Then don't. Escort us out." Quietly. Another pause. Then slowly Martin nodded. 5 minutes. That's all I can give you." Relief washed through Clara, sharp and dizzying. "Thank you." As Martin turned to leave, Jonathan exhaled shakily. "That was close," he whispered. "It's not over," Clara replied, already helping him to his feet. "But we're moving." They followed Martin down a narrow service hallway, away from the murmurs and lights of the main hall. The air grew cooler, the sound softer. Every step felt like a small victory. Jonathan leaned heavily on Clara, but he moved with determination, grit shining through his weakness. At the end of the corridor, a service elevator waited. Martin pressed the button and glanced back at them. "You didn't hear this from me," he said quietly, "but people are asking questions. Powerful people." Clara's jaw tightened. "They always do." The elevator doors slid open with a low hum. As they stepped inside, Martin hesitated. "Be careful," he said. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than it looks." The doors closed, sealing them inside a metal cocoon. The elevator began its slow descent, each second stretching longer than the last. Jonathan sagged against the wall, his strength fading. Clara steadied him, her thoughts racing ahead. Where could they go? Who could they trust? The envelope in her pocket felt heavier now, as if reminding her that answers came with consequences. The elevator dinged softly as it reached the underground level. The doors opened to a dim parking garage, echoing with distant footsteps and the hum of engines. Clara guided Jonathan toward her car, parked near a concrete pillar. The smell of oil and cold air filled her lungs. She unlocked the door and eased him into the passenger seat, buckling him in carefully. As she rounded the car, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She froze. Unknown number. Her stomach tightened as she answered, keeping her voice low. "Hello." "You shouldn't have interfered," a man's voice said, calm and cold. "This doesn't end well for people like you." Clara glanced at Jonathan through the windshield. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling slowly. "Who is this?" she demanded. A soft chuckle crackled through the line. "Someone who knows the truth. And who's watching you leave, right now." Clara's breath caught. She spun slowly, scanning the shadows of the garage. Between two parked cars, a silhouette shifted, then disappeared. The call ended. Her hands shook as she lowered the phone. The sense of safety she'd felt moments earlier evaporated, replaced by a chilling certainty. They weren't alone. And whatever had brought Jonathan back from the dead wasn't finished with them yet. Clara slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors with a sharp click. She started the engine, her eyes fixed on the dark corners of the garage. As the headlights cut through the shadows, she realized one terrifying truth. Getting Jonathan out had been the easy part. The engine's hum was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence as Clara navigated the slick streets of New Haven. Rain still fell in relentless sheets, smearing the streetlights into golden streaks across the windshield. Jonathan sat beside her, wrapped in the blanket she had brought, his pale face half hidden in the dim glow of the dashboard. He hadn't spoken since the phone call, and Clara didn't push. She knew the moment required caution, not questions. Her mind raced faster than the car. The call. The warning. Someone was watching them. But why? Who could have orchestrated his supposed death? And why send a threat now while they were already vulnerable? The answers she suspected would be more complicated and dangerous than she could imagine. "Clara," Jonathan finally murmured, his voice weak but steady, "we can't stay here. Not long." "I know," she replied, keeping her hands tight on the wheel. "We need somewhere safe. Somewhere off the radar." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, focusing on her. "I can't risk anyone finding me. If they know I'm alive," he trailed off, letting the unspoken danger hang between them like smoke. Clara nodded. She had spent years navigating crises that weren't hers, solving problems without recognition. This was just bigger, deadlier, and more personal. Her heartbeat pulsed in her ears, each thump a reminder that time was slipping through their fingers. They passed the familiar city streets, now drenched in darkness. Storefronts reflected in puddles like fractured mirrors, and the occasional pedestrian hurried past with umbrellas, oblivious to the life-altering events unfolding in the car beside them. Clara stole a glance at Jonathan. His hand rested lightly on his lap, fingers twitching slightly as if testing the reality of being alive. "You don't have to move fast," he whispered. "I can walk, but it's safer if we keep moving." Clara shook her head. "No. I can get us somewhere private faster than you can manage. You're still weak." They drove in silence for several blocks, tension thick between them. Then a flicker of movement caught Clara's eye, a shadow darting across the road, too fast for a pedestrian, too deliberate to be random. She tensed, instinct screaming that they weren't alone. Jonathan's eyes followed hers, sharp now despite his weakness. "They've found us," he said simply. "No panic, just fact." Clara's fingers tightened on the wheel. She had to act. "Stay calm," she said. "We're almost there." The GPS she had set before entering the mansion led them to a secluded warehouse on the edge of the city, a place she had discovered years ago during one of her temporary cleaning jobs. Abandoned, quiet, and mostly forgotten by the world, a perfect temporary hideout. Clara guided the car down a narrow driveway and into the shadows of the warehouse, headlights illuminating broken windows and rusting metal doors. The rain beat against the roof in a relentless rhythm, masking the sound of their tires crunching on gravel. She killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening. Nothing. Just the rain. The isolation was eerie but necessary. She glanced at Jonathan. "We're safe, for now." He exhaled, a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "For now," he echoed. Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the envelope, hesitating. She had carried it across town through rain, tension, and risk, and now it was in her hands. The seal was worn, and she could feel the weight of its contents as if it were alive. She glanced at Jonathan. "We need to know what's inside," she said softly. "It might explain everything." Jonathan's eyes met hers, haunted but resolute. "Be careful," he warned. "Some truths can't be unsealed without consequences." Clara's fingers trembled as she broke the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper filled with handwriting she didn't recognize. The words were precise, deliberate, and chilling. "If you are reading this, Jonathan Wellington is alive, but not for long if the wrong people discover him. Trust no one. The answers you seek are closer than you think, but danger follows every step." Clara swallowed hard. Her heart pounded. The handwriting was careful, almost clinical, yet every word carried the weight of threat. Someone had known about Jonathan's survival, and whoever it was had left instructions, but also a warning. Jonathan leaned forward, voice barely audible. "We're not just hiding from strangers," he said. "We're hiding from people who built an empire on controlling the narrative. If they know I'm alive, it's not just my life at stake, it's yours too." Clara looked at him, the enormity of the situation sinking in. They had escaped the funeral, but the real battle had just begun. The warehouse was silent except for the rain, but outside, the world was already closing in. Footsteps, voices, eyes watching from the shadows, they weren't alone. And if the past had taught Clara anything, it was that people who watched waited for mistakes. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. "Then we move forward," she said, voice low, determined. "We find the truth before they find us." Jonathan nodded, wincing slightly. "And the first place we look is somewhere no one expects. The warehouse smelled of damp metal and old wood, a cold, hollow space that echoed every small sound: footsteps, the rustle of fabric, the faint drip of rainwater seeping through the cracked roof. Clara stood near the car, her fingers still clutching the envelope. Jonathan sat on the edge of a crate, pale but alert, his hands folded in his lap. The chill in the air didn't matter. The tension was enough to make them both sweat. "We can't stay here long," Jonathan murmured, his voice low but steady. "Even a secluded warehouse can be compromised. Someone will notice we disappeared." Clara nodded. She already knew that. Their enemies, those who had orchestrated the elaborate lie of his death, wouldn't wait patiently. They would act, and they would act fast. Her mind raced, scanning options, calculating risks, and planning escape routes. A soft knock sounded at the warehouse door, echoing eerily across the concrete floor. Clara froze, her pulse spiking. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Yes," he said, his tone flat. "They're already tracking us. That wasn't random." She swallowed hard, glancing around for anything to use as a barricade. But the space was bare, abandoned, offering very little protection. They had bought themselves a few minutes, maybe 10, but no more. Clara approached the door slowly, careful to make no sound. Through the small, grimy window, she could see a shadowy figure lingering outside. They didn't move quickly, but they didn't leave either. Intentions unknown. "Whoever it is," she whispered to Jonathan, "they're waiting for a mistake." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Then we don't make one." Clara pulled back from the door and knelt beside him. "We need a plan," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of adrenaline. "We need to disappear before anyone realizes we're gone." Jonathan leaned back, eyes closing briefly. "There's one place," he said softly. "Somewhere that no one would suspect. Not even them." Clara tilted her head. "Where?" He shook his head. "I'll show you. But it's not easy. And it's dangerous. If we're wrong," his voice trailed off. She gritted her teeth. "We don't have a choice." Outside, the shadow moved slightly, as if sensing their conversation. Clara pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering, and whispered, "We have to move now." Jonathan struggled to stand, weak but determined. Clara helped him, supporting his weight as they edged toward the back of the warehouse. A small, rusted service door led to an alleyway she hadn't noticed before. It was narrow, slick with rain, but it would give them a chance to escape unseen. The moment the door opened, the cold night air rushed in, cutting through the tension like a knife. Rain splattered across their faces, but Clara barely noticed. She kept moving, leading Jonathan carefully down the narrow alley. Every step echoed faintly, each shadow seeming to conceal a potential threat. "Stay close," she murmured. "No sudden moves." Jonathan's hand brushed hers for balance, and she felt a spark of relief amidst the fear. Even now, with danger pressing in from all sides, there was comfort in knowing he was alive, and that he trusted her implicitly. The alley stretched for several blocks, narrow and twisting, before opening onto a quieter street lined with shuttered shops. Clara paused for a moment, glancing back. No one followed. For now they were unseen. But safety was temporary. She knew that. They were moving from one precarious moment to another, each step fraught with danger, each breath carrying the weight of uncertainty. She tightened her grip on the envelope. The message inside was more than a warning, it was a challenge. Someone had laid out a path for them, but the stakes were high and missteps could be fatal. Jonathan's eyes met hers, steady and resolute. "We follow it," he said. "Every step. No deviation." Clara nodded, determination settling over her like armor. "Then let's go. We're not done yet." The alley stretched ahead, dark and slick with rain, a path into uncertainty. But for the first time since the funeral, Clara felt a spark of hope. They had survived the impossible. Now they had a chance to uncover the truth, and maybe, just maybe, take control of it before their enemies did. As they disappeared into the shadows, the warehouse behind them seemed impossibly still, holding its secrets in the cold night air. But the world outside was watching, waiting, and calculating. And somewhere in the darkness, someone was following. The rain had stopped, leaving streets slick with water that reflected the pale glow of streetlights. Clara and Jonathan moved cautiously through the quiet neighborhoods on the outskirts of New Haven. Their footsteps echoed softly against wet pavement, a rhythm of tension and urgency that matched the pounding in Clara's chest. Jonathan leaned slightly on her arm, each step a reminder of how fragile he still was. "We can't stop for long," he whispered, eyes scanning the empty streets. Even a minute of hesitation could give them a lead. Clara nodded, glancing over her shoulder. Shadows clung to alleyways and doorways like dark predators. She had learned to read them over the years, patterns of movement, the slightest shifts in light, and her instincts screamed that someone had been following them since the warehouse. They turned a corner into a narrow side street lined with abandoned buildings. Rusting fire escapes and boarded-up windows gave the impression of total neglect, which was exactly what they needed. Clara led Jonathan toward a squat brick building she had scoped months earlier, one she knew had a forgotten basement. Few people in the city would think to check it. She pushed open the door and it groaned in protest. The smell of damp earth and old wood hit her immediately, but she barely noticed. Her focus was on Jonathan, making sure he moved safely. They reached the basement stairs, descending into near-complete darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of a single hanging bulb at the bottom. Jonathan sank into a wooden chair, relief flashing briefly in his eyes. Finally, he breathed, voice barely audible. A moment of quiet. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around him, her own tension refusing to ease. "Quiet doesn't mean safe," she warned. "They're still out there." He nodded, eyes heavy, exhaustion settling in. "I know. But I can't keep running without rest." Clara sat opposite him, unfolding the envelope again. The handwriting had haunted her mind all along, each word a whisper of warning. Trust no one. Danger follows every step. Answers are closer than you think. Jonathan reached for the paper, eyes scanning quickly. His brow furrowed. "Someone wanted me to survive," he murmured. "But they didn't want anyone to know. And they didn't want me to act too soon." Clara frowned. "Someone who knew your death was staged?" He nodded. "Exactly. But it's deeper than that. I've been targeted for years. People who profit from controlling the truth, they can't allow me to live openly." His voice dropped lower. "Not even with allies." Clara's stomach twisted. Every instinct she had screamed danger. "Then we plan. Carefully. We can't make a mistake. Not now, not ever." He met her gaze, eyes sharp despite the fatigue. "The funeral, it was just the beginning. They wanted everyone to believe I was dead, to lull people into a false sense of security. Some of my closest associates believed it. That makes it worse." Clara exhaled slowly. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, dark and intricate. A plan of deception years in the making, now threatened to entangle anyone who got too close. Including her. A sudden noise, metal scraping against concrete, made them both freeze. The basement door rattled faintly as if tested by a cautious hand. Clara's heart raced. "They found us," she whispered. Jonathan shook his head. "Not yet. But someone is curious. Or bold." Clara's mind raced. They needed a strategy, a way to move without alerting the watchers who seemed to close in with each passing moment. She scanned the basement, her eyes landing on old storage crates and a narrow utility hatch leading further down. It was tight, uncomfortable, but it would give them a hidden path. Jonathan grimaced. "It's risky," he said. "But better than sitting here waiting." Clara nodded. "Risky is all we have." She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight carefully. The chill of the basement bit at their skin, but it was nothing compared to the weight of what lay outside. Unseen eyes, hidden threats, and the knowledge that the moment they made the wrong move, everything could collapse. They crept toward the utility hatch, every step measured. Clara's hand was steady on Jonathan's arm, guiding him down into the darkness. The narrow space swallowed them almost immediately. The air was damp, thick with the smell of old pipes and concrete, but it offered concealment. As they descended, Jonathan whispered, "Whatever is coming, it's more than a threat. It's a test. And we've just reached the first stage." Clara swallowed hard, the words settling over her like ice. They were alive, yes, but not safe. Not yet. And the deeper they went, the more dangerous the truth would become. Somewhere above, the world continued, oblivious to the two people who had just defied death and deception. But Clara knew better. In this darkness, they were moving into the eye of a storm that could destroy everything they thought they knew, and everyone they cared about. And in the shadows, someone was waiting. Watching. Patiently. The narrow utility tunnel was cold and damp, the air thick with dust and the faint metallic tang of rusted pipes. Clara's shoes squeaked softly against the concrete, each sound amplified in the confined space. Jonathan leaned heavily on her arm, pale and trembling, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every shadow for threats. "Stay close," Clara whispered, her voice barely above the sound of their movement. "We don't know what's waiting for us down here." Jonathan nodded, his jaw tight. "I can feel it. They've been planning this for a long time, waiting for the perfect moment." The tunnel curved sharply, forcing them to crouch slightly. Water dripped from the ceiling, landing in small puddles at their feet. Clara carefully guided Jonathan around each obstacle, noting exits, potential hiding spots, and the faint hum of city life above. For now they were unseen, but every second heightened the tension, a quiet reminder that safety was only temporary. "Clara," Jonathan whispered, voice low and strained, "when I was gone, they thought no one would know. But you," his eyes met hers, filled with something she hadn't expected. Gratitude, trust, and something heavier. "You risked everything to find me." Clara swallowed, blinking back the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "I couldn't let you disappear," she said simply. "Not again." "I won't." They moved forward in silence, the only sound the occasional drip of water or the faint scurrying of a rat somewhere in the darkness. Each step carried the weight of urgency, and Clara felt the pressure building, not just from their enemies above, but from the knowledge that what lay ahead might reveal truths neither of them were ready for. As the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, Clara paused. The space was cluttered with old machinery and discarded crates, giving them some cover. She guided Jonathan to a corner, easing him onto an upturned crate. He leaned back, eyes closing for a brief moment, and Clara felt the fragility of the moment. "Clara," he said softly, opening his eyes again, "I need to tell you something. Something I never wanted anyone to know." Her pulse quickened. "What is it?" Jonathan drew a shaky breath. "The plan to fake my death. It wasn't just to protect me. It was part of a larger scheme. Someone inside my company, someone close. They wanted control. My disappearance, my supposed death, it was the key to their plan." Clara's heart sank. Betrayal. Someone they had trusted had orchestrated all of this, manipulating events, lying to everyone, including her. "Do you know who?" she asked cautiously. Jonathan shook his head, tension etched across his features. "Not entirely. But there are clues. I've left a trail, hidden messages, signals. Things that only someone paying attention would notice. And you found some of them." Clara felt a cold wave of realization. Every risk she had taken, every decision she had made to reach him, had been part of something bigger, something she had barely understood. The weight of it pressed down, but she forced herself to remain steady. A sudden noise, a low scrape from the tunnel entrance, made them both freeze. Clara's eyes darted to the shadowed opening. Her breath caught. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, approaching. Jonathan's hand found hers, trembling slightly. "They're here," he whispered. "And they've known more than I thought." Clara swallowed hard. Her mind raced. They were trapped in the chamber with only the tunnel leading back to the street, an avenue that could be watched, ambushed, or worse. Every instinct screamed that the approaching footsteps weren't casual. She whispered urgently, "We need to move. No. There's another exit here. Follow me." Jonathan rose with effort, leaning heavily on her. They crept past the old machinery, the bulb overhead flickering as if mirroring the uncertainty surrounding them. The distant steps grew louder, echoing through the tunnel, a haunting rhythm of pursuit. Finally they reached a narrow steel door, rusted and heavy. Clara pushed it open slowly, revealing a steep metal staircase descending further. The smell of damp concrete intensified. Without hesitation, she guided Jonathan down, step by step, their shoes clanging softly against the metal. As they reached the bottom, Clara paused, listening. Silence. For a moment, it seemed they had evaded detection. But the tension didn't fade. It coiled tighter, reminding her that danger was always close, always watching. Jonathan leaned against the wall, breathing shallow but steady. Clara, thank you, he murmured, his voice barely audible. She met his eyes, seeing the weight of exhaustion and relief mirrored in her own reflection. We're not safe yet, she reminded him. But we're moving. And that counts for something. Outside the tunnel, far above, footsteps continued to echo faintly, a chilling reminder that their enemies were patient, methodical, and relentless. And in the darkness, Clara realized that survival would demand more than courage. It would require uncovering truths that might be more dangerous than death itself. The narrow staircase opened into a long, dim corridor, its walls lined with cracked concrete and exposed pipes. The air was heavy with the smell of damp stone and rust, the faint hum of the city above barely audible through layers of concrete. Clara's shoes scuffed softly against the floor as she led Jonathan forward, his hand gripping hers for support. Each step was measured, deliberate. Any misstep could betray their presence. Jonathan paused halfway down the corridor, his breath shallow. Clara, he whispered, voice barely audible. I haven't told you everything. About why they wanted me gone, about what they're capable of. Clara's heart tightened. She glanced at him, catching the faint flicker of fear in his eyes. Then tell me now, she said. We need every piece of the puzzle if we're going to survive this. He nodded, wincing as he shifted his weight. Years ago, I uncovered some irregularities in the company's finances, transactions that shouldn't have existed, offshore accounts, secret deals. When I started asking questions, I realized some of the people closest to me weren't loyal. They were willing to do anything to gain control, including faking my death. Clara's stomach churned. The depth of the conspiracy was far greater than she had imagined. And the funeral? She asked, her voice low. Was it just to mislead the public? Jonathan shook his head slowly. It was to mislead everyone. My employees, the board, the media, and anyone who might have suspected the truth. The person behind this, they wanted power, and my absence was the key. But I left clues. Messages hidden in documents, emails, even small codes in meetings. Things only someone paying attention would notice. Clara's mind raced, processing the implications. Every risk she had taken, every decision she had made to reach him, had been guided by a series of cryptic clues he had planted, almost as a lifeline. They moved forward again, the corridor stretching ahead like a tunnel through time and danger. Shadows seemed to flicker and stretch with each passing step, and Clara could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Every echo, every distant sound felt like it could be a threat. Jonathan stopped suddenly, glancing over his shoulder. They're closer than we think, he whispered. Someone's been tracking us since the warehouse. And they're patient, they wait for mistakes. Clara tightened her grip on his arm. Then we don't make one. The corridor opened into a wider room, cluttered with old crates, rusted machinery, and discarded furniture. The flickering light of a single bulb gave the space an eerie glow. Clara guided Jonathan toward a crate near the far wall and helped him sit. We need to figure out our next move, she said quietly, scanning the room for anything useful. We can't keep running blindly. Jonathan leaned back, exhaustion etched across his face. There's one person who might help. Someone who knows the truth, someone who's been on the inside. But it's risky. If they turn against us, we could be walking into a trap. Clara's stomach tightened. Then we prepare for that possibility, she said firmly. We can't afford to trust blindly, but we also can't do this alone. A faint noise echoed from the corridor behind them, a soft scuff, almost imperceptible but enough to make Clara freeze. Her eyes darted toward the source, scanning the shadows. Jonathan followed her gaze, tension flickering in his expression. They're here, he whispered. Or someone is. Clara exhaled slowly, forcing her mind to stay clear. We need to move. Quietly. And carefully. She helped Jonathan to his feet, guiding him toward a narrow side door partially concealed behind a stack of crates. The handle was cold and worn, but it opened smoothly. Beyond it was a narrow alley that led into the city streets. As they stepped outside, the chill night air hit them sharply. The city was quiet, eerily so, the kind of silence that suggested someone, or something, was watching. Clara glanced around, her senses heightened, every instinct alert. Jonathan's hand brushed hers briefly. "We're not safe yet," he murmured, voice tense. "But at least we're moving. And every step counts." Clara nodded, determination settling over her. They had survived so far, but the real challenge, the confrontation with the person behind it all, was still ahead. Every clue, every cryptic message, every careful move they had made would lead them to a moment of truth. Somewhere in the city, shadows shifted. Eyes followed their progress. The chase was far from over, and the danger was only growing. And as Clara guided Jonathan down the alley, she knew one undeniable truth. The closer they got to uncovering the secret, the deadlier it would become. The alleyway opened onto a quieter part of the city, a row of shuttered storefronts and narrow streets that smelled faintly of rain and asphalt. Clara guided Jonathan carefully, keeping him close as they moved. His steps were slow but determined, each one a testament to the will that had carried him through the past days of danger and deception. "We need a place to regroup," Clara whispered, her eyes scanning the streets. "Somewhere we can think without being followed." Jonathan nodded, leaning slightly on her arm. "There's someone I've trusted, though very few know of them. They're discreet, careful. If we can reach them, they might be able to guide us." Clara felt a spark of hope but also a chill of caution. "We don't know if anyone is truly loyal anymore," she said. "Not after what's happened. How do we know they won't turn us in?" Jonathan gave a tight-lipped smile, faint but real. "Because they saved me once long ago. Before all of this. And I trust that they remember. Enough to help." Clara nodded, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders. The night air was sharp, and she could see his pallor even in the dim light. She felt a pang of guilt. He had survived a staged death, and yet here he was, barely able to walk, relying on her entirely. But she didn't let herself dwell on it. There were more pressing matters. They reached the corner of a quiet street where a small diner once stood, now closed for renovations. Behind it, a narrow stairwell led down to a basement-level office Jonathan had mentioned only in passing, a place used for discreet meetings and exchanges. "This is it," Jonathan whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. "If anyone can help us, it's here." Clara guided him down the steps, careful not to make a sound. The door at the bottom was heavy and reinforced, but Jonathan opened it easily, producing a small key from inside his coat. Inside, the room smelled faintly of paper and coffee, a surprising comfort in a night filled with tension. Seated at a desk was a woman in her early 40s, calm and collected. Her hair was pulled back, and her eyes held the sharpness of someone who had seen far too much. She looked up as they entered, her expression flickering between surprise and concern. "Jonathan," she said softly, rising to her feet. "I didn't expect. I thought you were." Clara stepped forward quickly. "He's alive," she said, her voice firm. "And we need your help. Now." The woman nodded, regaining composure quickly. "I see. Then there's no time to waste. They've been watching, haven't they?" Jonathan let out a small sigh. "Since the funeral. And they're not alone. They know more than I realized." The woman motioned toward a corner of the room, where a small table and chairs had been set up. "Sit. We'll talk strategy. But first, we need to understand what's at stake. Who knows you're alive and how many are against us?" Clara helped Jonathan to a chair, his hands trembling slightly as he sat. She took a seat across from him, glancing at the woman who now held the key to their next moves. As they began to lay out what had happened, the funeral, the threats, the messages, the chase through the city, the tension in the room grew. Every detail added another layer of complexity, another shadow to consider. Finally, the woman leaned back, eyes narrowing. "This is worse than I thought. Whoever orchestrated the funeral didn't just want you gone. They want complete control. And the longer you remain alive and visible, the more dangerous it becomes, for everyone involved." Jonathan's gaze flicked to Clara, gratitude and fear mingling in his expression. Then we act fast. We uncover the truth and we take steps to protect it. But we must be careful. One wrong move. Clara's stomach tightened. The truth, she realized, was no longer just about survival. It was about strategy, deception, and trust in a world where betrayal could come from any direction. A low hum from the street above made them all freeze. Clara's hand instinctively went to the small pocket in her coat where the envelope rested. She could feel its weight pressing against her fingers, a reminder that the next move would change everything. Jonathan's eyes met hers. "This is it," he said. "Whatever happens next, there's no turning back." And in that moment, Clara understood. They had escaped the funeral, the shadows, and the immediate threats. But the real battle was only just beginning. The web of lies, power, and danger stretched out before them, and each step would be more treacherous than the last. Outside, the city remained silent, but Clara knew better. Eyes were everywhere, watching, calculating, waiting for the slightest mistake. They were alive, but not safe, and the next revelation would shock them all. The woman locked the door quietly and drew the blinds, sealing the small basement office off from the street above. The faint hum of traffic faded, replaced by the low buzz of the fluorescent light overhead. The room felt suddenly smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Jonathan sat upright now, the fatigue in his body momentarily overtaken by urgency. "We can't stay long," he said. "If they've tracked us this far, time isn't on our side." The woman nodded once. "I agree. That's why we need to be precise." She turned to Clara, studying her carefully. "You weren't supposed to be part of this. Yet here you are." Clara met her gaze evenly. "I didn't plan on crashing a funeral either," she said. "But once you see something like that, you don't just walk away." A flicker of something unreadable crossed the woman's face. "Then you understand more than you think." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder worn at the edges. Jonathan didn't just fake his death to disappear. He did it to force a reaction. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "I needed to see who would move first." Clara's brow furrowed. "Move how?" The woman opened the folder and spread its contents across the desk. Printed emails, transaction summaries, meeting logs. The moment his death was announced, 3 board members initiated actions they'd been sitting on for years. Emergency votes. Asset reallocations. Quiet legal filings. Clara's chest tightened. They were waiting for him to be gone. "Yes," the woman said. "And they moved fast. Too fast for people who were grieving." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "That's how I knew." Clara stared at the papers, her mind racing. "Then the funeral wasn't just a goodbye," she said slowly. "It was a signal." Jonathan nodded. "To them it meant the obstacle was gone. To me it meant they exposed themselves." The room fell quiet. Somewhere above them a car door slammed. Clara felt the sound in her bones. The woman leaned back. "There's more. Someone leaked information to the media before the official announcement. That level of access narrows the list." Clara swallowed. "Someone very close." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "Someone I trusted with everything." The weight of that settled between them. Betrayal didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived quietly, dressed as loyalty. A sudden vibration broke the silence. The woman glanced at her phone, her expression tightening. "That's not good." Jonathan looked up sharply. "What is it?" She turned the screen toward them. "A security alert. Motion detected. Rear entrance." Clara's pulse spiked. "They found this place." "Not necessarily," the woman said, already moving. "But we treat it as if they have." She crossed to a cabinet and pulled out a set of keys. "There's another exit. It leads into the old service tunnels under the block. You'll come out 3 streets over." Jonathan pushed himself to his feet, wincing but steady. "And you?" "I'll stay," she said. "If they're watching, it's better they see me." Clara hesitated. "That's dangerous." The woman gave a thin smile. "So is letting them know he's still alive." Another vibration. Louder this time. Insistent. "Go," she said sharply. "Now." Clara helped Jonathan toward the back door, her heart pounding. The weight of everything pressed down on her. The lies, the danger, the realization that this had been planned long before she ever stepped into that mansion. At the threshold, Jonathan paused. He looked back at the woman. "If anything happens." She cut him off. "Finish what you started." They slipped into the narrow passageway just as a heavy knock echoed through the office. Claire didn't look back. She couldn't. The tunnel smelled of oil and damp concrete. Their footsteps echoed as they moved quickly, the sound of the door slamming behind them ringing like a gunshot. As they walked, Jonathan spoke quietly. "The person behind this, they won't stop. Not now." Clara nodded. "Then we don't either." Ahead, the tunnel curved into darkness. And with every step, the truth became clearer and more dangerous. Behind them, voices rose. They had been found. And next time, escape wouldn't come so easily. The tunnel spat them out behind a row of dumpsters 3 blocks away, the metal grate clanging softly as it settled back into place. Clara didn't stop moving. She pulled Jonathan with her until they reached the shadow of a boarded-up storefront, both of them breathing hard, listening. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. Too far to help. Close enough to raise questions. Jonathan leaned against the brick wall, his face drawn tight. "They moved faster than I expected," he said quietly. "Which means they already knew about that office." Clara's stomach sank. "So the leak is bigger than we thought." "Yes," he replied. "And closer." They waited in silence, counting seconds. No footsteps followed. For now. Clara glanced at him. "You said you trusted her." "I still do," Jonathan said. "Which means whoever is orchestrating this didn't just infiltrate the company. They've been mapping every contingency. Every ally." The thought sent a chill through her. This wasn't panic-driven chaos. It was controlled. Strategic. Someone patient enough to fake a man's death and wait for the fallout. They moved again, blending into side streets and darker blocks. Jonathan's steps were steadier now, adrenaline pushing him forward, but Clara could feel the tension in his arm. Every passing car made her flinch. After several turns, Jonathan slowed. "There's somewhere else," he said. "Not safe, but necessary." Clara raised an eyebrow. Those 2 words usually don't belong together. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "It's an old property. Not in my name. Not in the company's either. I used it once years ago when I needed privacy." "Why not use it before?" she asked. "Because I hoped it wouldn't come to this." They reached a quiet residential street lined with aging townhouses. The kind of place people stopped noticing decades ago. Jonathan led her to one with peeling paint and a rusted mailbox. Inside, the air was stale but dry. The furniture was sparse. Dust lay thick on every surface. "This place hasn't been touched in years," Clara said. Jonathan nodded. "Exactly." He moved toward a small desk in the corner, opening a drawer with practiced ease. Inside were documents, neatly arranged. Clara watched as he pulled out a slim folder, his expression darkening. "This," he said, "is why they wanted me gone." He handed her the folder. Inside were contracts, names redacted but dates unmistakable. Financial trails. Decisions that shifted millions, no billions. Clara's breath caught. This could destroy people. "Yes," Jonathan said. "And it could expose the person behind all of this." She looked up. "You know who it is." "I suspect," he corrected. "But suspicion isn't enough. Not when they control narratives, legal teams, and entire boards." Clara closed the folder carefully. "Then why tell me now?" Jonathan met her gaze. "Because if something happens to me, you'll need to know." The words hit harder than she expected. A sudden noise broke the moment. A car door outside. Too deliberate. Too close. Clara moved instinctively, pulling Jonathan away from the window. "Lights," she whispered. They stood in darkness, barely breathing. Footsteps approached the front door. Slow. Confident. Not rushed. Jonathan's voice was barely audible. "They're not here to scare us." The doorknob turned. And this time there was no tunnel waiting behind them. The doorknob turned slowly, metal grinding against metal, deliberate and unhurried. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs as she pulled Jonathan farther back into the darkness, pressing him against the cold wall. Neither of them breathed. The door creaked open. A silhouette filled the doorway, blocking the faint streetlight outside. The figure didn't rush in, didn't speak, just stood there as if listening to the house itself. "Jonathan," a voice finally said. "Come." Familiar. Almost gentle. "You always did prefer the quiet exits." Jonathan stiffened. Clara felt it instantly, the tension running through him like an electric current. His fingers tightened around hers, not in fear but in recognition. "You shouldn't be here," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his body. The figure stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The click of the lock sounded unnaturally loud. A man in his late 50s emerged into the dim light, well-dressed despite the late hour. His expression held no anger, no urgency, just patience. "Neither should you," the man replied. "You made quite the mess by staying alive." Clara's pulse roared in her ears. This wasn't a thug. This wasn't an errand runner. This was someone who didn't need to threaten. Someone who expected compliance. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "So it was you." The man gave a faint smile. "I wondered how long it would take you to figure that out." Clara glanced between them, piecing it together too late. The familiarity. The confidence. The way the man spoke as if he owned the room. "You were at the funeral," Jonathan continued. "Standing with my family." "Of course," the man said smoothly. "Where else would I be?" Grief is a useful disguise. Clara felt a cold wave wash through her. "You planned all of this," she said quietly. "The death, the board moves, the chase." The man turned his attention to her for the first time, studying her with interest. "You're sharper than I expected." Jonathan shifted slightly, positioning himself closer to Clara without thinking. "Leave her out of this." The man chuckled softly. "That's not how consequences work." Silence stretched. Heavy. Suffocating. "You were supposed to stay hidden," the man continued. "Recover quietly. Let the company stabilize. Let the transition finish." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You mean let you take control?" "I already have control," the man replied. "You're the loose end." Clara's mind raced. This was the first major truth laid bare. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a voice, a calm certainty that chilled her more than any threat. "And the maid?" the man asked casually, eyes flicking back to her. "You didn't plan for her." Jonathan said nothing. "That's always the problem," the man went on. "The variables no one accounts for." Outside, a car engine idled. Another. Clara realized with sick clarity that they weren't alone. The man took a step closer. "Here's how this ends," he said calmly. "You come with me. Quietly. No more running. No more mess. We say you were confused, traumatized. You disappear properly this time." Jonathan laughed once, short and bitter. "You'll kill me." The man didn't deny it. Eventually. Clara's chest tightened. She felt Jonathan's grip shift, subtle but intentional. He was thinking ahead. Planning. "You're forgetting something," Jonathan said. The man raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "You need me alive," Jonathan replied. "Those documents? They're not the only copies." The man's smile flickered. Just for a moment. Clara caught it. Jonathan continued, voice steady. "If anything happens to me, or to her, everything goes public. Media. Regulators. People who don't take bribes." The room went very still. "You're bluffing," the man said, though the certainty was gone now. Jonathan met his gaze. "Try me." A beat passed. Then another. The man sighed as if disappointed. "You've always been stubborn." He stepped back toward the door. "This isn't over. You know that." Jonathan nodded. "I do." The man opened the door and paused. "Enjoy your borrowed time." When the door closed, the silence that followed was deafening. Clara's legs nearly gave out. She leaned against the wall, breath shaking. "That was him," she whispered. "That was the one." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Outside, the engines drove off. But Clara knew better than to feel relief, because now they weren't just running from shadows. They had named the enemy, and enemies who lose patience become far more dangerous. The silence lingered long after the engines faded, thick and heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Clara didn't move at first. Her legs felt unsteady, her palms damp against the wall. It wasn't fear alone, it was the shock of finally seeing the truth stand in the doorway and speak her name like she was an inconvenience. Jonathan broke the stillness with a slow exhale. "We don't have much time," he said. That visit wasn't a warning. It was a calculation. Clara straightened, forcing her voice steady. "He expected you to break. Or run." Jonathan nodded. "And now he knows I won't." They moved deeper into the house, careful but efficient. Jonathan gathered what little remained: documents, a small encrypted drive, an old phone whose battery miraculously still held a charge. Clara watched him with new eyes. Not the frail man pulled from a coffin. Not the victim of a staged death. This was someone who had been planning survival long before anyone thought he needed it. "You said there were other copies," Clara said quietly. "Were you telling the truth?" Jonathan met her gaze. "Yes, but not where he thinks." She felt a flicker of relief and dread. "Where then?" "Across the border," he replied. "A legal trust. Independent oversight. If anything happens to me, the release is automatic." Clara absorbed that. "You planned for your own disappearance." "I planned for betrayal," Jonathan said. "It just arrived sooner than expected." They didn't stay long. The house was compromised now, even if it felt momentarily calm. Before leaving, Jonathan paused in the doorway, looking back at the dust-covered room. "I thought hiding would protect everyone," he said quietly. "Instead, it put you in danger." Clara shook her head. "You didn't force me into this. I chose to stay." They walked out into the early morning air. The sky was just beginning to lighten, a dull gray stretching across the horizon. It felt wrong, how normal the world looked after everything that had just happened. They drove without speaking for several minutes, the city slowly waking around them. Delivery trucks. Early commuters. Life continuing as if no billionaire had been buried and resurrected in secret. Jonathan finally spoke. "There's one more thing you need to know." Clara glanced at him. "I'm listening." "The man who came tonight," he said, "he isn't acting alone. He never has." Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You mean the board?" "And others," Jonathan added. "Legal, financial, political. People who benefit from silence." Clara felt the weight of that press against her chest. This wasn't just corporate betrayal. It was systemic. They pulled into a quiet rest area just off the highway, surrounded by trees. Jonathan needed rest. And they needed to think. As he slept briefly in the passenger seat, Clara stepped outside, breathing in the cold air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message. A known number. "You did well tonight. But loyalty has limits." Her blood ran cold. She deleted the message immediately, heart racing, and glanced back at the car. Jonathan stirred, sensing something. "We're being watched," she said when he opened his eyes. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Yes. And now they're testing you." Clara swallowed. "Testing me how?" "To see if you're leverage," he replied. "Or a liability." The realization hit her hard. She wasn't just collateral damage anymore. She was part of the equation. And whatever came next would force her to choose, not just who to trust, but how far she was willing to go to protect the truth. The road stretched ahead like an unanswered question. Clara drove with both hands tight on the wheel, eyes scanning every mirror, every shadow along the roadside. The message still echoed in her mind. Loyalty has limits. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was an invitation. Jonathan sat upright now, fully awake, his expression unreadable. He hadn't asked to see the message, and Clara hadn't offered. Some things she sensed were better revealed slowly. They reached the safe house just after sunrise. From the outside, it looked abandoned, peeling paint, boarded windows, a place most people would pass without a second glance. Inside, however, it was clean and functional. Solar-powered lights flicked on as Jonathan keyed in a code. The faint hum of backup generators filled the space. "You planned all this," Clara said quietly. Jonathan gave a thin smile. "I learned long ago that wealth attracts more predators than protection." He moved with practiced ease, unlocking cabinets, checking seals, scanning the perimeter monitors. Clara watched the screens. Nothing obvious. No cars lingering. No figures in the trees. That almost made it worse. Jonathan stopped in front of a steel case and opened it. Inside were folders, drives, and a single envelope marked with her name. Clara froze. "Why is that addressed to me?" Jonathan hesitated. "Because if I didn't survive, you were meant to." She stared at him. "You never said." "I didn't want to burden you with that possibility," he said. "But after tonight, there's no point pretending." He handed her the envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a legal affidavit, already notarized, transferring temporary control of certain assets and, more importantly, custodianship of evidence. "This makes you my proxy," Jonathan said softly. "If I disappear again, by choice or force, you become the voice they can't silence." Clara felt the room tilt. "I didn't ask for this." "No," Jonathan agreed. "But you were chosen. Long before any of this." She looked up sharply. "Chosen by who?" "By circumstance," he replied. "And by integrity. You could have walked away weeks ago. You didn't." Before Clara could respond, the monitors flickered. One screen filled with static, then resolved into a live feed, inside the safe house. Her breath caught. "That's impossible." Jonathan's face hardened. "They shouldn't have access." A voice came through the speakers, calm and familiar. "Good morning, Jonathan." "Clara." Clara's pulse thundered. The voice belonged to the man from the house. The one who smiled like he was always winning. "You're trespassing," Jonathan said evenly. The man chuckled. "You've always been dramatic. Relax. If we wanted you gone, this place would already be ash." Clara felt her phone vibrate again. Another message. This time a location pin and a photo. Her younger brother. Sitting in a cafe. Unaware. Alive. The realization hit like a blow to the chest. "They found my family," she whispered. Jonathan turned to her sharply. "What?" "They know who I am," she said, voice shaking. "And they're using him." The man's voice continued, almost gentle. "We prefer cooperation, Clara. You seem reasonable. Unlike Jonathan." Jonathan stepped forward, fury barely contained. "Leave her out of this." "But she's already in it," the man replied. "The question is how deeply." The screen cut to black. Silence slammed back into the room. Clara sank into a chair, heart racing, thoughts spiraling. "This is my fault. I should never have stayed." Jonathan knelt in front of her. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "They're escalating because they're afraid. Not because they're strong." "They have my brother," she said, tears burning. "What am I supposed to do?" Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a look she hadn't seen before, resolve sharpened by regret. "We don't give them what they want," he said. "We outmaneuver them." "How?" Clara demanded. "They're everywhere." Jonathan stood and retrieved another drive from the case. "By revealing just enough truth to make them panic, and keeping the rest hidden." He paused, then added quietly, "But it will require a risk." Clara wiped her face and met his gaze. "Whose life?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Possibly yours. Possibly mine." Clara swallowed hard, the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, an engine started and then stopped. They weren't alone anymore. The knock didn't come from the door. It came from the back wall. 3 short taps. Pause. Then one longer knock, as if someone was testing the thickness of the concrete. Clara stood slowly, every nerve on edge. Jonathan raised a hand, signaling silence. He moved toward the control panel, fingers flying across the keys. The perimeter cameras switched angles. One by one, the screens showed nothing. Trees. Fog. Empty gravel. "That's not possible," Jonathan muttered. "No one should be able to get that close without triggering motion sensors." The knock came again. Louder this time. Clara's heart hammered. They're inside the perimeter. Jonathan reached into a drawer and pulled out a small device, no bigger than a phone. He pressed a button. Somewhere in the walls, mechanisms shifted. Steel reinforced concrete. Safe room protocols. "Stay behind me," he said. The voice came next, muffled but unmistakable. "Jonathan." "Clara." "You don't have to hide." Clara felt her stomach twist. "It's him." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I know." The voice continued, oddly calm. "I came alone. No weapons. No tricks. Just a conversation." Jonathan laughed without humor. "You're terrible at telling the truth." Pause. Then the voice softened. "I brought something you'll want to see." One of the monitors flickered on. Live feed. A hospital room. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her brother lay on the bed and four in his arm, eyes closed. A doctor adjusted a monitor beside him. He looked unharmed. Peaceful even. "What did you do to him?" Clara whispered. The voice answered gently. "Nothing permanent. Just enough sedation to keep him comfortable. We're not monsters." Jonathan snapped. "You drugged him to make a point." "Yes," the man replied calmly. "And the point is leverage." Clara felt dizzy. Her brother was alive. For now. Relief and terror collided in her chest. "What do you want?" she demanded. The wall panel slid open with a soft hiss. The man stepped inside as if he owned the place. Tall. Impeccably dressed. That same infuriating smile. He raised his hands slightly. "I want an end to this dance." Jonathan positioned himself between them. "You're standing in a very dangerous room." The man nodded. "I know. That's why I came personally." He looked at Clara, his eyes sharp now. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Clara's fingers curled unconsciously around the envelope in her pocket. "And you took something that doesn't belong to you either." He smiled. "Temporary borrowings. On both sides." Jonathan said, "You won't walk out of here with what you want." The man tilted his head. "That depends on how much Clara values her family." Silence stretched. Clara took a step forward before Jonathan could stop her. "If I give you what you're asking for, you let him go." Immediately. Jonathan turned sharply. "Clara." She shook her head, eyes never leaving the man. "This is my line to draw." The man's smile faded, replaced by something closer to respect. "You're stronger than I expected." "That's not an answer," Clara said. He nodded once. "Yes." He walks free. No surveillance. No strings. "You have my word." Jonathan scoffed. "Your word is worthless." The man glanced at him. "Yet here you are. Still alive." Clara exhaled slowly. "What exactly do you want?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The final archive. The one Jonathan never finished decrypting. The one that exposes everyone, including him." Jonathan stiffened. Clara turned to him. "Is that true?" Jonathan hesitated. Just for a second. That was enough. "There are names in that file," he said carefully. "Powerful ones. If it's released without context, it could destroy innocent people along with the guilty." "And if it stays hidden?" the man asked. "More victims. More silence." Clara felt trapped between two truths, both sharp enough to cut. She thought of her brother. His laugh. The way he used to call her whenever life felt too heavy. She made her decision. "I'll give you a copy," she said. "Not the original. And not all at once." Both men looked at her. "You release my brother first," she continued. "I verify he's safe. Then you get part one. You want the rest? You keep your distance and disappear." The man studied her, eyes narrowing. Then, slowly, he smiled again. "You're negotiating from a position you don't technically have." "Try me," Clara said. "Because if anything happens to him, everything you're afraid of goes public within minutes." Jonathan stared at her. "What did you do?" She met his gaze. "I prepared." The man laughed softly. "Impressive." He pulled out his phone and typed. Seconds later, the monitor switched feeds. Her brother, awake now, sitting up, confused but unharmed. A nurse smiled and spoke to him. "Release confirmed," the man said. "Your move." Clara's hands shook as she reached for the drive. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. And Jonathan realized too late that this wasn't the end of the game. It was the moment Clara took control. The rain had stopped by the time dawn broke, but the air still carried that clean electric smell that followed a storm. Clara sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the mug in front of her. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't noticed. Jonathan stood near the window, watching the horizon lighten. He hadn't slept. Neither had she. The man was gone. No alarms. No goodbye. Just the absence he always left behind. Clara finally spoke. "He'll keep his word. About my brother." Jonathan turned slowly. "I believe that part." She looked up. "You don't sound relieved." "I am," he said. "But I'm also terrified." She let out a short, humorless breath. "You should be." Jonathan didn't argue. 2 hours later, Clara's phone rang. A video call. A known number. She answered without hesitation. Her brother's face filled the screen. Well, a little thinner, but alive, fully awake. "Clara," he said, blinking. "They told me I could call you. I don't really understand what happened." Her chest tightened. She forced herself to smile. "You don't need to. Are you okay?" "I think so. They said I had some kind of reaction. I'm being discharged later today." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she held them back. "I'll come get you." After the call ended, Clara sat very still. Jonathan watched her carefully. "It's done," she said quietly. Jonathan nodded. "For him." She turned to face him. "What's in that archive?" He didn't deflect this time. "Proof," he said, "that the man you buried wasn't the only one playing dirty. Corporations, politicians, foundations that pretend to save the world while quietly draining it." "And you?" she asked. He swallowed. "I knew more than I acted on. I told myself timing mattered. That strategy mattered. Meanwhile, people got hurt." Clara absorbed that in silence. "He wanted the archive to control the narrative," Jonathan continued, "to trade silence for protection. And you wanted to control it to decide who deserved the truth," Clara said. "Yes." She stood, walked to the counter, rested her hands there. "You're both wrong." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Clara?" "No," she said gently. "I spent years cleaning rooms where powerful people slept peacefully. I listened to them talk. Confess things they assumed no one important would hear." She turned back to him. "Truth isn't something any one person should own." Jonathan studied her face. He saw it then. The shift. The woman who had walked into a funeral unseen was gone. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I already did it," she said. He froze. "Did what?" She reached into her bag and pulled out her laptop. Opened it. Turned the screen toward him. A secure site. Anonymous. Files queued for release. Time drops. Each one redacted just enough to protect victims, clear enough to expose patterns. "You leaked it," Jonathan whispered. "Pieces," Clara corrected. "To journalists who know how to verify before publishing. To watchdog groups. To people who won't sell it back to the highest bidder." Jonathan sat heavily in the chair. "You just made enemies you can't see." Clara nodded. "I've been invisible my whole life. I know how that works." There was no triumph in her voice. Only resolve. "What about him?" Jonathan asked. "The man who came here. If he tries to stop it," she said, "he exposes himself. If he doesn't, the truth still comes out." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "You planned this." "I had time," she said, "while everyone else assumed I was just cleaning." Silence settled between them. Finally, Jonathan said, "What will you do now?" Clara closed the laptop. "Take my brother home. Help him heal. And then, I don't know." She paused at the doorway, then looked back at him. "But for the first time, that feels like freedom." Weeks later, headlines would explode. Investigations would open. Names would fall. Some would deny. Some would disappear. Some would finally answer questions they'd avoided for decades. And somewhere in the noise, a quiet truth would surface. The billionaire's funeral hadn't been interrupted by a madwoman. It had been interrupted by someone who refused to let a lie stay buried. If this story made you feel something, anger, hope, or even discomfort, stay close. Stories like this don't end in one place, and neither do the conversations they start. And if you're watching from somewhere out there right now, unseen but listening, you're not alone.